Hello and welcome to a revision tutorial from the Henry VIII and Wolsey topic. We're going to focus on why events to obtain a divorce failed. So here's what we'll cover. We'll look at a chronology of events first of all, and then we'll look at the three policies that Henry and Wolsey followed to try to secure a divorce. And then lastly we'll have a look at the role of some key individuals and set some tasks. Here's a chronology of events. Just pause the presentation now and read through, and then I'll start speaking again. Okay, so it was in 1525 that Henry VIII had first become infatuated with Anne Boleyn, but only 2 years later that active proceedings began to secure a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Henry VIII tasked his chief minister, Cardinal Wolsey, with this job, and Henry assumed that this would be a fairly straightforward thing for Wolsey to achieve. Firstly, because Henry was used to getting what he wanted, and secondly, he was used to Wolsey getting him the things that he wanted. But just weeks later, the diplomatic situation in Europe changed, and this meant that Wolsey's task became much more difficult. And this happened when forces of the Emperor Charles V sacked the city of Rome, effectively making the Pope Charles his prisoner. Now Charles was a nephew of Catherine of Aragon, they were both Habsburgs, and Charles began to actively oppose Henry and to support his aunt Catherine. And in the early stages of the campaign, Henry's preferred route was followed, and his preferred route was that there would be a public acknowledgement that his marriage to Catherine was invalid in the eyes of God. We'll have a look at why that would be the hardest route forward. And when this route failed by 1528, we see Wolsey increasingly active diplomatically. And in 1528 to 1529, tactics changed, and pressure was put on the Pope to allow the case to be heard in England. The Pope eventually agreed to this, and then we have one of the spectacular set pieces of the Tudor period in 1529, when a papal court is set up at Blackfriars in London, where Wolsey and another cardinal, Cardinal Campeggio, hear the case. But the case broke up without judgment by July, which left all three routes ending in failure. We'll look firstly at the attempt to secure a divorce by proving that the original dispensation was invalid. Pause the presentation and have a read through about this approach, and then we'll have a talk about it in more detail. So the goal of this policy was to force the papacy to admit that the original dispensation was invalid theologically. The whole idea of the Pope overruling the Bible was invalid, and that the Pope had no right to do this. Essentially, Pope Clement VII would have to admit that a previous Pope had made a mistake. And this is exactly the case that Henry and Wolsey set out to prove. Theologians were paid quite high sums to write pieces in support of Henry's argument. But this was countered by supporters of Catherine of Aragon, who were similarly paid to write opposing pieces. And so very quickly, a very public, a very high profile argument was underway. So this approach really goes nowhere. Contextually, it couldn't have come at a worse time. From 1517 the Reformation had started in Europe. A German monk, Martin Luther, had criticised the papacy and challenged papal authority. And the papacy was under real pressure. There couldn't have been a worse time to try to persuade a pope to publicly admit a mistake. Secondly, the high-profile nature of this approach attracted the interest of Charles V very quickly. Reputations were on the line, and this partly explains his keenness and willingness to step in support of his aunt. And thirdly, it wasn't just international opposition that Henry faced. Catherine also had important and influential supporters in England, including Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, who both wrote in her support. Okay, let's look next at a second approach, that of getting round the dispensation on a technicality. Again, just pause the presentation and have a read through, and then we'll have a talk in more detail. So this approach is much more pragmatic. It was one that Wolsey favoured. It became quite clear very early that the initial approach wouldn't get them too far. So the idea is that rather than the Pope having to admit a theological mistake, that a mistake had been by a clerk, that literally the documents had been badly written so they weren't valid, thereby avoiding any awkward questions of papal authority. But this approach again was effectively countered by Catherine and her agents. There were versions of the dispensation in England, but also in Spain as well. And it was found that the text in the Spanish document was secure, that it got round some of the problems and criticisms that were raised in the English text. And so Charles effectively countered this by simply refusing to allow the Spanish document to leave Madrid. He wouldn't allow any English lawyers or theologians to get their hands on it. So again, this approach really goes nowhere. So our first two approaches have failed. Let's look next at the court case. There's lots to take in here. Pause the presentation, have a careful read through, and then we'll go through things in detail. So the first two approaches had taken months, and it was clear that it wouldn't be as easy as just getting the Pope to sign off this divorce. So the goal of this approach was to have the argument settled in court, but to have that court judged in England in Henry's favour. Now the way this would work was that Cardinal Wolsey was a papal legate, and that he could sit and represent the Pope in this court and find in Henry's favour. But remember, this isn't in the Pope's interest, and it's not particularly practical. The Pope is effectively controlled by Charles V, and he was in a really difficult position. It's not that the papacy wanted to annoy Henry. He would have loved to have had Henry as an ally. He just simply couldn't go against Charles V. So a long drawn out series of events happens. Firstly, the Pope agreed for a trial to happen, for a court case to happen, but it wouldn't be judged just by Wolsey. He would send over another cardinal, Cardinal Campeggio, to hear the case jointly. Now Campeggio, who's the second image down, took a long time to arrive in England. And when he did arrive, in the autumn of 1528, he was in no hurry to start the case. The hearing started in March. Now, before this, Campeggio had tried to persuade Catherine to agree to Henry's demands, to end the marriage and to become a nun. But Catherine had refused to do that. So a dramatic court case started. It was heard in Blackfriars in London. And on the first day of the hearing, Catherine spoke in her defence. She threw herself at Henry's feet, begging for him to think again, that she had been a loyal wife, humiliating Henry. And she stormed out of court in tears, and she never returned to the court, leaving Henry sitting there embarrassed. Now, in the weeks that followed, we've got lots of scurrilous and sensational evidence that's heard, highly personal stuff about Catherine's physicality and whether or not she'd been a virgin when she'd married Henry, all kinds of things that a Habsburg princess shouldn't really have unveiled in public. And what this did was to gather public opinion in her favour. Now, the court was suspended in the summer, with Campeggio arguing that this is what happened with papal cases when they were heard in Rome, so it should happen here as well. And he left the country, much to Henry's annoyance and much to Wolsey's frustration as well. And in Campeggio's absence, the Pope simply announced that the court was over and that the case would now have to be heard in Rome. So the whole thing had been a huge delay and a massive embarrassment. Be aware of the importance of Catherine's role here. She puts up a spirited public defence of herself and her marriage. She'd resisted pressure from the papacy to quietly give in, bullying tactics from Henry and Wolsey to an extent to give in, and this partly explains the huge swell of public opinion in her favour. So let's look at some analysis and some tasks for that. Okay, here's your first task. Here are 7 individuals that we've discussed. Just see if you can write a sentence or so on each one of them, explaining how they played a part in the failure of the divorce campaign. Okay, here's our second job. Just pause the presentation and read through this source. It's a letter written by Campeggio to Pope Clement VII. So just pause the presentation at this point and read through. Now, I think we've got an incredibly dramatic source here. This is great stuff. It really brings to life Catherine's approach and her personality and her determination, as well as the quiet manipulation and persuasion of Campeggio. There are some great moments in this source where you can get the idea of the drama of the language that Catherine was using as Campeggio tried to convince her to quietly become a nun and to give up on her marriage, on her status as queen, and of course on the possibility of her daughter Mary becoming queen and inheriting after. If you look close to the bottom, you know, that got that great piece of repetition where she says she might be torn from limb to limb to limb, and he can't compel her to alter this opinion. So see if you can discuss, just in a short paragraph on each, what does this source show you about the attitude to the divorce campaign of firstly the papacy, Clearly, it's not just one of outright opposition to Henry. And then secondly, what does it show you about the attitude of Catherine herself? And here's our last job. I've called this a mini essay just because it can become a structured piece of writing. So we've got our hypothesis. Henry VIII failed to secure divorce from Catherine of Aragon by 1529, largely because of the diplomatic situation in Europe. See if you can write a paragraph that agrees with that position and see if you can tell me why. Then a separate paragraph disagreeing. Again, try to be specific and bring in some points to the contrary. And then lastly, a short decision. Where do you stand and why? You could, of course, turn that into a larger scale essay. But for us, with the job that we've got here, there's no need to. Just a short, structured piece of writing. Okay, thanks for watching. Remember, there's plenty more support material on the CHSG History YouTube channel.